Greetings all. Welcome back to another episode of the Coptimizer podcast. So we're kicking off season 2. So with us this morning in the studio is Todd Langley. You're my first 2-time guest on the Coptimizer podcast. And for your reward, you got some of my finest coffee made in the French press. A little shout out to Cafe Milagro. They're not a sponsor, but maybe they should be.
A lot of branding going on today.
All right. Hey, just a quick reminder. So Todd is the CEO and founder of Crisis Response Leader Training. And he was a guest on, I believe it was episode 3 from season 1 of the Coptimizer. And his area of specialty is active shooter response, crisis response. And we'll talk a little bit more about this on this episode. Last year, we just kind of touched on a little bit about what he's doing at the end of the episode, and we knew that we wanted to bring him back. We started with his background and his experiences in the special operations community and what that meant to his experience and his vision for where he really sees gaps in the public safety space and how we can improve our response to not just active shooter events, but crisis events overall. Is that a pretty good summary?
Motivation wise, yeah. Are we there yet?
Yeah, we're not there yet. No. I think we've got a long way to go. Would you agree or disagree?
I would definitely agree. We talked about it before, trying to figure out what we're going to talk about. And I think at least positive, what I saw maybe since last time we talked is a re-emphasis on individual level skills training, particularly in law enforcement, on the basics, what I call shoot, move, communicate, medicate, and including in with that use of force, lethal and non-lethal judgment type and de-escalation type training. I think that definitely got national attention and was emphasized in training models. And I think part of it, maybe as an outsider, what I see is that some of that was looked at as what was needed for maybe not rebranding of local departments, but certainly to increase or incentivize the recruitment drive, right? I think it's everybody realizes that law enforcement across the country are hurting and are probably down 15-20% on average. And so they're looking for new innovative ways to bring back people in and understand what can they do. And I think for a lot of new recruits, what they want is greater ability to be on the street, right? Be prepared to do the solo job. So I definitely see that has had renewed emphasis, where I think we still have a long way to go. And hopefully we're going to talk a lot about today is that when it comes to the complexity of emergency or incidents that may become a crisis, the problem is that we're not giving the change or the same level of emphasis that we're giving to individual skills. We're not doing that for the leader skills, in my opinion.
Well, there are so many areas that we are going to touch on today, and the shoot, move, communicate, and medicate. All 4 of those things they're really the foundation for training when you're training at the individual level. You have to train a new police officer how to fire a gun. And when you go to recruitment and retention, we also have to kind of touch on the changing landscape for the type of individuals that are moving into the law enforcement space. And while a lot of these things may seem disconnected, they're really not. They're all interconnected. They're all intra-related. You have to have the people with the right skill set. You have to have the people that have the capacity to learn, the desire to learn, the desire to serve. But when you're looking at the pool of where to draw from, the numbers just aren't there right now. We've got to do a much better job of creating an atmosphere where public safety, law enforcement in particular, is an exciting and meaningful career again, where it really has lost a lot of its shine in the last decade, because what we're going to talk about, I think, primarily today, we're not just about Uvalde, but in looking back at last year and where we were, and then what's happened this year. Of course, Uvalde had already occurred, but this year the report came out, the long-awaited report. I don't necessarily know that those of us inside of law enforcement saw anything that was shocking in there. I think most of us saw some of these gaps. Definitely a very powerful report, very useful report, and hopefully law enforcement leaders around the country and their teams have already plowed through that whole thing and have already created a list of prioritization for what they're going to do to ensure that they're not the next Uvalde agency. But I like to use Uvalde and some of these other events that we've seen this last year, going back to what I was just talking about, as an opportunity to really educate the public on what we need in law enforcement, what are the type of people that we're looking for, what are the characteristics and the traits that ultimately lead to or lend themselves to a new recruit eventually becoming a seasoned and very valuable police employee. And quite frankly, it all starts with the capacity to do hard things. You got it. I mean, this policing, there's a big focus on community policing and partnerships, and I'm a huge advocate for that. I believe wholeheartedly in that. The police are part of the community. I'm a big Pelian principle leader in law enforcement. I've always worked off of those principles. But at the same time, you got to be able to take a punch, not just figuratively, but literally. You got to be able to take a punch, and then you got to get back in the fight. You can't just quit.
I think the first thing, and I'm probably not going to be a good expert on the motivation, like what entices somebody to want to become a career law enforcement officer. And I think that's the first problem. And that's not necessarily just the department's job. It's not the chief's job to figure that out. That's a community and a national society issue. And, in locations where the community's got the back of the blue and, building them up in a level of trust and esteem, and then incentivizing them through a good career progression with good, benefits and everything else. I think that is a part of the problem. When we come down to the individual level and what you're talking about with, being able to take the punch, I think part of what I see, and putting in context, I'm not law enforcement, never have been, had a pretty unique pipeline in the military and the intelligence community. But I see the crossovers, and I am a consultant for some states in what it means to close quarter battle and the very tactical level of what it might mean in crossover to active shooter events. So I do get to interact and see some of that.
Well, I just for the audience, and we're not here to tell war stories, but your bona fides far exceed that of what even the most seasoned street cop is going to experience. You've been shot at, blown up, dropped into some of the most dangerous places on the planet in some of the most volatile circumstances, and you're still here with us today. And so, that's why I do really appreciate you taking all that wisdom and experience and being willing to share it. And because we don't get that very often, and not just share it, but share it in a way that is so, I think, meaningful. Because one of the things that we've seen nationally this year too is about there's been some criticism about the type of training that's been coming from the military and into law enforcement, where we tell these war stories and everybody gets themselves all pumped up. Look at me, I'm a badass. And you can be a badass too. And sometimes people take that message the wrong way. I have mixed feelings about that because I do think all training needs to be very professional, and you got to be very specific about what your learning objectives are going to be. But it also has to be interesting and dynamic. And nobody wants to go sit in a classroom and watch a boring instructor go through a PowerPoint. They want to know that somebody's been there and done that, that's got good experiences, that can take kind of these interesting life experiences and then translate it out into what we're going to do professionally out in the field. But there is a line that if you cross that line, it goes from being professional to unprofessional, and that's a little sidebar. But
Well, I think it plays into it. Some of it's needed, and a lot of it needs to be put in the right context.
Right.
I think part of it is that there does need to be this. We talked about it in the first interview about the competence building to confidence. Well, what happens when you start building a little bit of confidence, but you've got too much confidence? Well, does that lead you into making poor decisions, whether that's your interaction with the community or making a bad tactical decision? That's kind of that fine line. Maybe to break it down in terms of, because there's a lot to break down. I mean, let me see if I can build it the right way. Let's take it from.
Well, we got all day, so
I got plenty.
We'll try to keep it at 90 minutes.
So I think probably the audience will understand a crawl to walk to run mentality of training, right? You got to learn how to do one before you get to the other. If you go too complex, then you're probably not building up the muscle memory or the validation of your standard operating procedures, your tactics, techniques, and procedures. So you need to crawl first. When you go into that walk stage, you're kind of validating that somebody can demonstrate they can do the proper sequence of events, whatever the training objective may be. And then the run is where you're having them do that in a scenario-based capability that allows them to have to do, some type of adaptability. What happens when a stressor is thrown at you? The problem that I see where we're at right now in the training cycle, even at the individual level for law enforcement and first responders, here's a good example is maybe once a year, maybe twice a year, if you're lucky, you'll get somewhere around 8 hours of react to an active shooter incident that includes close quarter battle as a singleton officer or maybe up to a team of 4.
Well, I can just tell you right now, there's very few officers that are getting 8 hours of that training.
That's pretty unfortunate because we could go into we can talk about the forgetting curve.
We'll come back. Yeah, I don't want to knock you off your train of thought there. But.
Well, here's so what we'll get into, and I see it when we talk about training someone in understanding tactics. So let's say you're going to do you're moving down a hallway. Imagine this: you're moving down a hallway towards an active shooter, but you don't know where the suspected shooter is actually at. You're moving down the hallway in a school. You've got some closed doors and a couple open doors, and you see an open door and something drives you to determine you have to go inside that room. You're going to check the long adjacent space. You're going to do a threshold evaluation, step to center, identify corner fed, center fed. You're going to move to the statistical probability of the threat, establish a point of domination, identify, neutralize the threat, clear, and then set yourself back up. And then if the threat is in that room, you then go into controlling the living, search the dead, those kind of parts of work inside of the CQB. When I'm training somebody to do that and establishing a fundamental, they will go and stick that point of domination and stay out of the fatal funnel. So let's talk about that. When you come into the threshold, right, that fatal funnel is kind of like an hourglass. It's the direction of the focus of the threat with their rounds towards the threshold, but the bullets don't stop there. So they kind of cross over and it makes an X. I call it an hourglass. What we try to train people in understanding is when you move through the threshold and go to your point of domination, you need to be out of that fatal funnel. Most operators, when they're injured in CQB, are injured from an adjacent space issue, not in the room that they're in conflict with. So that's part of the issue of establishing the point of domination out of the fatal funnel. They'll do that, no problem. Train in the walk or the crawl to walk phase, they do that, right?
Right.
But we'll go into a team of 2 or team of 4. And then we put in a threat and simunitions. And what do you think the number one man does? At least 60% of the time.
Stops in the funnel.
Or drives direct to threat and stays in the fatal funnel the entire time. So everybody else has no line of fire, and we have a huge increase in potential fracture side. And the problem that I'm trying to explain in this example is that you're only going to get so far in a crawl to walk where you don't put in additional stressors, whether it's a time stress, if you got to move faster, you got to be more accurate with your shot placement, or you're going to receive some pain and you have to fight through that. And if you include that with the forgetting curve piece of, hey, based on repetition, you need to revisit this training objective probably 4 times per year in order for it to stick at a minimum. If you're not doing that, well, then it just cascades back into, okay, I'm stuck outside doing threshold evaluation. I lost momentum. The bad guy's on the other side and he's shooting through the door, and now I don't know what to do.
Okay, and let's talk about that specifically. And I know some people are just listening. So, and I think probably most people that are listening to this have seen what happened in Uvalde. They've watched the videos. It's been plastered on the news for a couple of years now. But they've also seen the Nashville response. And so if you compare and contrast there, because I think those are 2 pretty specific examples that highlight exactly what you're talking about. In the Nashville case, once they got into the school, and I understand there's some questions about how long that took and whatever. I mean, all these things are going to be dissected down to the second in an after action review, which they should be, because we got to learn what we did well and what we didn't. I get a little protective when we get hypercritical about certain things, especially with people that don't understand and have not been there and have not done it. But I think that was a good illustration of them moving as a team. You had one person that really took over the leadership role and pushed that element as they moved through the school. They ultimately make contact with the shooter on the 2nd floor. There's no hesitation. After they engage the shooter, they advance on the shooter, make sure that the threat is stopped, and there's an example of what everybody looks at as a favorable response, a good response. When you go back to Uvalde, and we can touch on one of the things that we've learned, not just from watching as it unfolded, but from the report that's come out and some of the criticisms, it wasn't the response time that's in question in Uvalde, because they were there almost immediately, on scene within a minute and a half. And they did actually have an element that moved fairly quickly and got to that point where they did have first contact. And so going back to what you're saying, you get into the funnel, you move, you make that contact. And that's where everything went wrong in Uvalde. I think sometimes we forget that they did approach, but when the shooter punched back a little bit, so to speak, or towards the police, then the decision was to fall back, regroup, and then they moved into that contain and call out, the more traditional response that we thought we had moved past 20 years ago. Specifically, what I wanted to point out there too is that there was an officer that was injured in that exchange, but that's the funnel that what Todd is talking about is that door to get into the classroom is the funnel. And it's easy to do that in training when we know that we're just practicing, when we're just doing that crawl phase, when we're walking through, when we're learning how to move and how to move, not just as an individual, but also with 2, 3, 4 people. First person goes right, the second person's going to go left, and you're feeding off of that. But what happens when something unexpected occurs, like you get shot at? And just because there's a funnel in a doorway doesn't mean that rounds don't also travel through walls next to those doorways. And maybe point of failure number 1 there was, instead of pushing through and engaging, the decision was made to fall back. And that's easy for people that are watching to make that decision. That's not as easy when you're there. And I think that goes to what you're talking about. You have to train multiple times a year. You have to put yourself in high stress situations, and you have to amplify the stress and learn to train through it and to fight through pain. And that's where I go back to the literal analogy. You got to learn to take a punch. And we're not doing that well. We're just not. And we're training a generation of people that have been programmed to be nonviolent and non-confrontational. And just to be frank about it, we're training them quite to assume that somebody else is always going to be there to solve their problems for them, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a principal, whether it's the police. And this goes back to your point. Well, we've got to decide what we want the police to be responsible for. And then we've got to properly resource them to be able to actually meet those expectations. But when you have 1,000 things that are a priority, nothing is a priority. And it's hard. You can't prepare for everything. So that was, again, another long lead up into that. But I think that kind of sets the stage for some of the things that we really wanted to hit on today.
Well, imagine, I don't know, did you ever do box drills or hooded box drills? I mean,
oh yeah.
So
but we do that in a SWAT environment, right?
Okay.
And so I spent 12 years in SWAT. I was an operator. I was a point man at one point. I was a team leader, and eventually team commander. And I just being candid, we did things on our SWAT team that the average patrol officer doesn't do. Not only did we do hooded box drills, but we wouldn't allow, and we did these with simunitions, and we wouldn't allow people to wear bulletproof vests and thick sweatshirts. I mean, we did these drills with throat protection, groin protection, and eye protection. And so you knew.
I don't know if they'll see it. I've got a scar from UTM on my forehead that's probably never going to go away.
Yeah. Well, I didn't ask permission, so I won't say his name in advance. But in a box drill, this was early on in my career. There was two of us, and we turned and both shot each other right in the face. And like I got it right on the left cheek. He got it on the forehead. And we both felt pretty good about it afterwards. It hurt like hell. Had a nice little scar. But this is I can talk about this stuff now, I guess, but therein lies the rub, is that there is a significant risk of injury in that, right? Is there a risk of death? No. But you now try to go do that kind of training with an entire police department, and you'll have a revolt on your hands. People aren't going to do it.
Well, here's at least my perception watching in some of the news where I see the policy changes happening because of something simple like that training method. Imagine the 21-foot rule kind of concept, right? And where the crossover is on the justified use of force. So let's say the suspect has got hands I can't see, and okay, he's reaching for something and he's outside the 21 foot. I'm still trying to judge what's going to happen. And the hooded box drill is to be able to get you faster into determining a shoot no shoot typically, right? Or which one I'm going to use kind of scenario. Imagine that now to where officers are being put on the stand because of that issue.
Go back just a second, because I cut you off a minute ago, and then we never actually did describe for the listener what is a hooded box drill.
Well, that is, you have a hood, and there's usually somebody behind you that has some mechanism of pulling the hood off of you, and you're standing ready to go, and you can't leave this circle. And then as soon as the hood comes off,
it's about a 3 foot by 3 foot box is what we did.
You can't leave that. And then there's some scenario that could be happening around you in 360 degrees. So it's really to teach you immediate situation awareness, identifying risks, determine the appropriate scale of what you should do to respond to that. And then typically it's, sometimes it's going to be, intended to, try and not trick you, but, say, okay, that guy was reaching for a cell phone, right? He went in and you accidentally shot him because you were expecting that it was going to be pain, and those kind of stressors get into it. That's kind of fundamentally what it is. It is I would call that a good example of a run stage training exercise that's going to add stressors in, and it's going to have to make you, be really agile and adaptive on your feet. So that's kind of what it is. And typically what you do is you can do it where somebody's right up in your face, and it's all about what's your flinch startle response. What does that mean to, doing some type of combatives moves, or, getting standoff to be able to draw your weapon. But it can also be things like that 20-foot, 21-foot rule, which applies in most states in determining whether or not you have, justification for use of lethal force. Where I've seen some states now is because we're not confident in that, or we're going to put so many officers on trial because of that, because of aggressive, prosecution in our society. What have we gone to? We've gone to a lethal force officer, a de-escalation officer that might be prepared for taser, and then we've got a supervisor that's on scene. So we've got 3 people now responding to one call for service where there might be a violent confrontation rather than one. So at a minimum, based on a training and resource issue, I can't imagine how we're not reducing our ability to cover the rest of our jurisdiction because of what it means to apply more manpower to one problem at a time.
Yeah, and that goes back to if you're running 20% short on manpower, now the calls for service are not decreasing. So your increased manpower per call, there's a value equation there that's you're having to calculate every single time, because it's like everything else in life, right? When people are trying to balance their day, for everything that you say yes to, you're saying no to something else, or you're delaying your ability to get to that next thing. And that's really the change that's going on. And so the premise of the box drill is to amplify the stress, create that stress, and then train individual officers or operators to be able to negotiate that, make those decisions with an additional level of stress. When you walk into a room and you can see everything as you're going in, that allows you time to process but police officers don't often have time like that. They don't have the luxury of hindsight. And so we could talk about Carroll versus US. That's kind of the legal standard for the use of force. And the important part about that is the reasonable officer standard. And a lot of times civilians don't truly appreciate what that means to police officers, in that if an officer uses force in the line of duty, then they're not judged on the standard of what would the average citizen do if they were placed in similar circumstances. It would be, what would a reasonably trained officer's perspective be if they were in the same situation. And I'm a huge advocate of that. But yeah, I agree wholeheartedly about what you're saying, because it's hard enough to focus on the threat, let alone being focused on what the ramifications of a poor decision under stress might mean.
Well, that
added stress.
That's kind of where I was hoping to go to. Transitioning from an individual level training and preparedness consideration to a lot of what came out in the Uvalde, DOJ report, and in the after action review and studies that were done at the state level in Texas. A lot of it had to do with leadership. And what's your span of control? So when I talk span of control of the individual officer response and the ability of them to be able to integrate without any type of leadership decision making, what is that? I would say probably you can operate up to 2 to 3 people in a standard operating procedure, maybe up to 4, and they should all gel and have some type of common understanding of what their expectations are in some type of tactical situation. When you get to about the 4, there needs to be some level of supervision or direction giving. Now, what's the span of control of somebody supervising others? I've heard 4, 5, 6, 7. At some point in time, you understand, you get to a point of, I can only directly supervise so many people, and I need another echelon of leadership over the top of it. And I think that that's a big problem right now is that, okay, what if you are in close quarter battle and you lose the momentum because you can't get through the fatal funnel? What if you have that type of situation? Well, what's the next step there? If I remember, we had 7 moving from north, 7 moving from south towards room 111. That should be 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 plus another one. There should have been 5 leaders involved in there in critical problem solving and decision making. Not to continue beating up on Uvalde, there's another one where there was a barricaded suspect and an active shooter in a grocery store a couple of years ago, and they continued to look at it from a front of store perspective without even considering the isolation, cordon, or breach of the backside of the location in order to come in. It goes back to where's our span of control and supervision, and what are we doing to train leaders that when things go wrong, because almost there's a plan never goes wrong. I'm a huge planner.
Right.
I love planning because at least I can anticipate that, and if I identify it, okay, I can take care of it when it happens in execution. But more times than not, and I have a very recent example, we went through detailed planning for a hostage rescue that we just conducted in a nonprofit situation. I probably can't talk too much about it, but we successfully did a hostage rescue mission. Multiple countries, a lot of detailed planning had to go into it. You can imagine that on the X, things didn't go exactly the way I hoped they would go or planned that they would go. So when you have a planning consideration and you realize it's not going the way your plan's going to go, what do you think you're able to do more in focusing on a problem if you projected 90% of what could happen, now only have to deal with 10% of the potential activities? If I don't plan for anything, I have 90 to 100% of the problems that I have to figure out on the spot. And that's when leaders in a crisis situation become overwhelmed. So the problem that I see in transition is we are really emphasizing the need for individual officer training and awareness and preparation and capabilities. But where's the leadership aspect of that? Where are we doing to expand that capability to be able to go into that next level, right? So that we can look at what it means to, is there another room that I can breach through? Can I use the windows for distraction? Where's my containment cordon and my inner and outer perimeter? Where's the staging of my medical branch? When we talk about integration and synchronization of assets as a leader, there are some great programs out there, but I don't even think we're touching 5% of the training audience. And that is a huge problem for us in our first responder community right now.
Yeah, man, so much there. Going back to what you're talking about in span of control, and generally in law enforcement, we try to keep that at, like, from a shift perspective, when if you're a shift supervisor and you're just working a patrol shift, we try to keep that between 4 and 7. But that's rarely the case. It's not uncommon to have one supervisor being responsible for 20 to 30 officers. And I'm not saying that that's not manageable, but if you have more than one critical incident occurring, or it doesn't even have to be a critical incident, it can just be, let's just say you have a robbery investigation going on one side of your jurisdiction and a shooting occurs on the other side. This is where we could have a lot of talks about this, but this is where span of control starts to be an issue if you have a limited number of supervisors. So that's where training and preparation really becomes critical. And I think that's ultimately at the core of what we're talking about is getting everybody to a base level of competency is one thing, but then getting them into a continuous learning environment to ensure that they're learning from their past experiences, they're building on those, they're learning best practices, not just from inside of the organization, but outside of the organization, being able to ingest information that's coming in from a 700-page report from Uvalde, on top of everything else that an officer has to stay on top of, like just legal updates. Every single year, you're looking at anywhere from 10, 20, 30, 40 changes in state statute, local ordinance, federal case law, Supreme Court decisions, all of these things, they all impact your training and your the time that you have, like everything. And again, this kind of goes back to where everything becomes a priority. And this, all right, this is kind of where I wanted to touch on this in this conversation. How do we do this moving forward? Because I just right now, we're setting officers up for failure. We're setting police departments up for failure. From an accountability perspective, rarely, let's look at Uvalde. Rarely do we see anyone else taking any kind of accountability for a failed response there. It really is primarily on those first few officers that went into retrograde when they had that first contact. And I'm not even saying that was the wrong decision. I don't necessarily have a problem with that decision. The problem began there is now you look at leadership on scene. And I think this was to your point, right? You had a chief there, and he's inside the building, doesn't have his radio, can't communicate effectively. And now we call this the circus, right? It's that first initial contact when everything goes to shit, right? Like, and that's the old military planning saying, right? That goes back a couple centuries. I think, yeah, it's like every plan fails at first contact with the enemy, and so that's why you do have to train and prepare and be able to have those things in your toolbox. And we train officers that way, right? Like in the way that it's often phrased, and if police officers don't feel this, right? What's the one thing that that you hear time and time again? Well, I reverted back to my training. Like, I don't remember what happened in this high stress situation. I just reacted, I responded, and I fell back on my training. And to your point, if the training is limited, if it's not repeated frequently and often enough, and if it's not presented in a way that's going to, optimally stick with a person, then we're setting a leader up for failure. So this is where you have to start looking upstream. So that Uvalde right there, we have a point of failure. We have multiple points of failure there. But I will contend that not just there, but other places, failure started long before that day. It was just failure in waiting. And
it's not isolated.
No, it's not. And it's easy for people to point the finger at Uvalde, but what's the old saying? I'll look right at the camera when I do this. When I point the finger at you, I got three pointing back at me. And that's the way I hope everybody looks at this, particularly from inside law enforcement, is okay. We have learned a lot from this. We thought we learned a lot from Columbine, but yet we continue to repeat these mistakes over and over again. And the first person that's gonna take the blame, and rightfully so in that case, is the chief. He was responsible. He wasn't prepared. And if he was prepared, then he might have just failed in his response in that moment. But even then, even a chief of police has a boss, and you're working in an environment where we have multiple opportunities and multiple layers of bureaucracy and government that can have a system of checks and balances set up to ensure that we're doing the things that we need to do. And so now, and I think that was one of the lessons that came out of Uvalde, right? They didn't have a plan. So
yeah, this is going to go so sideways. I know the one thing they talk about.
I've already taken us off course three times.
They talk about memorandum of understanding, an MOU, and what it means to what I would think you guys call a mutual aid compact, right? So if you have a multi-agency, multi-jurisdictional response, certainly something like Uvalde, and probably almost any active shooter incident, it's going to overwhelm the resources of the jurisdiction. So you're going to have to call in other people. So that right there indicates it's above and beyond an incident command responsibility. In the national scene, they would call that the unified command.
Correct.
Right. So in unified command, who's responsible for establishing that authority and responsibility and the training and preparedness of that at the community level? So rather than saying that if this is a law enforcement issue, it's not, it's a community problem. But if I can go into a little deep dive, I think we got to understand, at least from my personal perspective, why do I feel like the leadership level, we're not doing the service we need to across the country in a better way for preparedness? And it goes back for studies that have been going on for over 150 years. And it's called, the steep learning curve to the forgetting curve. And I think Ebbinghaus is probably the first one as a site, one of those sites that kind of did some studies on this into the 1800s. And it is, you're going to have a steep learning curve, which is good because it means you're being introduced to new knowledge and you're going to try to retain that information. You're going to plateau at some point in time. So imagine that in our day-to-day training. Typically, does that not look like 40 hours of accreditation with a butt in the seat at the leader level?
Absolutely.
With maybe some practical exercise put in there. But as you have
with a varying degree and quality of instructors.
Right. So you've got standardization issue, instructor bias, you have limited time, limited resources, and you got to put out as much information as you can. So in studies, when you get up to that certain level of plateau, let's say you reach all of your learning objectives for your course. Historically, within 31 days of that material being introduced to you, you will lose 70 to 90% of what you were taught. Unless within that time period, you start to scale up in reviewing that information. So Ebbinghaus would also, and others would argue, is that if I can revisit that information over a 90-day period, 3-4 times, my knowledge retention is much higher. If you apply that into the crawl and walk and run, what you see is that, okay, I have to have frequency of training repetition in order to increase my knowledge retention, right?
Right.
That doesn't necessarily mean that I can do my job under stress because I haven't taken it into a complex adaptive model, which is essentially me throwing problems at you that you aren't prepared for because it falls outside the scope of the original training objectives. When you put the complexity in on top of the frequency of engagement or the frequency of your training, you're going to increase your engagement. That's called visual learning, whatever. Okay, now we get to a point of higher retention with critical problem solving skills under stress in a method that can work. Whether that is augmented in simulations, which we do, virtual reality, all the way back to hands-on in-person training. But that would kind of look like, okay, if I want to be good at something, I have to at least do it 4 times per year in order to get some higher knowledge retention. Oh, by the way, that comes pretty close into, and I know there's a lot of arguments about you don't need to do the muscle memory 10,000 draws to get good at a draw thing anymore. But at least in some type of correlation, you could say, if I'm going to do that for individual tactics, I need some type of repetition of leader skills as well.
Yeah.
Now, if I take that and look at our current problem we have across the United States that I feel we have, what we just talked before we started, and I think you said there are about 800,000 law enforcement officers in the United States.
Yeah, about 18,000 police departments, most of them, under 25 officers,
right?
80%.
So if I take that as a training audience and I take the teachers that I have that I would want to teach on the immediate response to an active shooter incident, just as an example, I think that's about 3 to 3.5 million. So we'll just call it 3.5 mil plus 800,000. We're at 4.2 mil. Now, if I have to train them 4 times per year, that'd be at least a factor of 4 times 4. That's 16 million that need a training focus on initial response to an active shooter incident between teachers and law enforcement. The federal system in requirement, and I know this because I was in competition for it, not butthurt too much that we didn't win. We were finalists. But the requirement for training at the national level for this program, which is the largest single source award of a grant for the nation, how many do they have to train per year? 1 time. You got a guess?
100,000.
20,000. So over a 20-year period, the organization responsible in receiving this has been able to train 300,000 officers or individuals through their civilian response program and their active shooter level 1 program. At least that's what they've announced on their public webpage.
And that is under a presumed train the trainer model that those people are going to then go out and train others?
Yes, there's a difference in the level 1 and the basic response, and then what it would mean to the civilian response.
Yeah, and I've got issues with. The train the trainer model is economical, but I don't necessarily know that it's the best way.
It's the filter down.
Yeah.
It's go right back on that for a second. Is if I lose 70 to 90% of what I was taught as the trainer, and then let's say 3 to 4 months later, I try to go back and transfer that. You can imagine it goes down in the pyramid, it's inverse. So I start up here and the knowledge that gets down to the person who needs it is very dwindled down. So that is a significant problem. But in summarizing what I was coming up with, Matt, because I'll wait for the Reddit troll crowd to come out and say, hey, you're off by a factor. But if I multiply that out in that training audience of 16 million training iterations need to occur, and at least one of those, there's certainly others. But if we take that one and over a 20-year period, they've only trained 300,000. We're talking 16 million times 20 years. We're not even training 2 to 3% of the training audience. So my problem is in our emphasis and focus, we're not going to get more training time. And we know that the trainer and the amount of training that's required at the national stage is not being met anywhere close to where it needs to be. What's the new alternatives that we're looking at to increase our knowledge retention and preparedness capabilities? I'm not saying anything we're doing is bad content. I'm not putting down any of those instructors. I know many of them, they're high quality people. Some of them are heroes, and I look up to them. I'm just saying that we're not achieving the end state. We're not making our communities more prepared based on our current training model at the national level.
Yeah, let that sink in for just a couple minutes or just a couple seconds. I don't want 2 minutes of dead air. And this goes back to, if everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. And because a couple of things in that I want to point out. Every state is a little bit different. We talked about this several times last year. Maybe the academy, maybe you have a centralized academy, maybe you have a local academy. You could have a college classroom type of environment where we're training and certifying police officers. But you'll find across the country, you're typically looking at anywhere from 14 to 20 weeks for a centralized standard academy. And I'll use Indiana as an example. The single requirement in the state of Indiana for you to, as a police officer, to deploy, to go out and arrest, have the powers of arrest, wear a badge, carry a gun, is you have to complete a 40-hour pre-basic course. And that's going to give you the basics on, you have to demonstrate firearms proficiency, some really simple physical tactics, and then it's mostly legal standards that you're learning in that 40-hour class. After that 40-hour class, you're good for the first year. And I think if you're in an agency that has sufficient resources, no one is going to take an officer that's been like right out of college or right out of whatever their job environment was, and give them a week's worth of training, throw them in a squad car, and say, have at it. The world is your oyster. You would think that would never happen, and you would be wrong. It does. It happens all the time, because there are places that are, I'm not saying it happens a lot, but there are places that just don't have the resources then to take that officer into and put them into an in-house training program, and then which then rolls into a field training program where you're shadowing an experienced officer who's guiding you through this, which at some point in that field training program is also going to involve your academy training. Your academies are designed to train officers to a core level of competency. And I think it's a tall order. It's a big ask that we have on our academies. And then if you look at the resources in academies, I look around I've been to a lot of different training academies and training programs over the years, but I look around and I see like some of our colleges and our universities, and I just see the millions and hundreds of millions and billions of dollars that we invest in higher education and developing these pipelines to bring in these students to go out, learn these important skills and trades and knowledge, education, and then to go do something with it, right? But in law enforcement, I mean, we are just scraping all the time just for the basics to try to get the basic stuff done, just even for the basic of safety equipment. There are still police departments out there that don't issue officers bulletproof vests. And even though we have grant programs available where agencies and municipalities can be reimbursed from that, there are agencies that are not carrying med kits. They're not training officers on med kits, and that you talked about that. Right? Shoot, move, communicate, medicate. Being able to do first aid, basic first aid. Sure, we can learn things like basic EMT, emergency medical response, in our academy setting, and maybe people are coming with individual skills, but then oftentimes officers don't even get that type of equipment. And yet when something like Uvalde happens, what we expect is the response from people from your community, like a special mission unit or SEAL Team 6, to come busting through the door and move with that type of proficiency, and that's just not reality.
No.
And we're not even close. And again, this goes back to my point where, what are we going to do about it? I mean, every year it's kind of like, because we're sitting here thinking, we're looking at this report, we're looking at the 700-page report. We see the incidents that are occurring. We watched what happened in Lewistown, in Nashville, just a couple weeks ago in Kansas City. And every single day there was another incident in Texas. We're just seeing these things. They're not going away. But while I do think our awareness has gone up in that we are deficient in the way that we're training, the level of resources that we're providing, where the rubber meets the road, I don't see it happening.
So this is a little bit old, but if you remember, you invited me into a community active shooter response drill at one of our local schools. So I got to shadow and watch that. And then I think you and I sat down after that, and it was a weekend level event. And we talked about what was that in terms of manpower and what did that mean in terms of labor and costs, things like that.
Right.
So as a community, we looked at it, and it looked like it was about $60,000 for that one weekend training, which maybe you'd be able to do once per year. If lucky. I would argue that it's probably not happening that much. Very similarly, there is an outstanding program out there where they will come in and they have computers with simulations and high quality instructors, and they have a defined format for incident response, all the bells and whistles, right? That is somewhere between $60,000 and $70,000 for 3 days of training, and then that's also done. When you get to those, I think and oh, by the way, at the time that I had that data, which is probably a year and a half old, but there was 100 cities on the wait list to get that level of training, and they were only doing 10 to 12 per year. So you had 3 to 4 years of waiting just to have that opportunity. Now imagine if that's the only opportunity you have for leader level training. When you get into that, don't you want to use that as probably a validation that you are prepared rather than having to start from ground zero? If you go from ground zero at that level of cost and that commitment of time, where do you think you will really be at by the end of that 2 to 3 days of training and then the fall off at the end? So at least in what I'm setting that up to say is if you're going to put that into your training strategy, and let's even say you could do that once per year, what are you building up to get to that as your validation exercise rather than just saying that that's some other training event? In between your basic certification and whenever you're going to do a validation level exercise, what's that repetition or that re-engagement of certain leader skills that you need to get up to that point of the validation in the end? We already know that, okay, with that, that sounds really great, Todd. But now you just talked to me, that's time investment, that's money investment. And before I go too far, I think in some of what I said earlier, it's going to seem like a large attack. I want to make sure I put out that I'm a firm believer in hands-on training. There's nothing better than quality instructors that can share their experience, and you get the opportunity to do live stressed events. I just mean that that currently isn't working very well because of the time and costs involved in doing that, and we're not reaching the entire training audience requirements. So we've got a gap. We've got the basic certification, and we've got a need for validation. What happens in the middle? We need to look for a hybrid situation or solution that allows us to combine opportunities for some type of stimulating, engaging lesson plans that can assess your knowledge retention and then build in the complexity so that you are at least greater prepared for when you get to your validation point. And that's where, at least in my company, what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, hey, look, we're not replacing the basic, maybe not too much, and we're definitely not replacing the validation. But in between this that allows us to get to preparation, it's a huge gaping hole. And what we need is some kind of hybrid solution that provides high quality instruction, maybe some use of AI that helps you facilitate it, engaging 3D scenario-based training, and allows you to increase your complexity so that when you go to the validation, you're not wasting your time.
Yeah. Validation is the last step in the training process. Is what we're doing effective? Is it working? The unfortunate reality is that some of the validation that we're getting nationwide is at an actual event. And what we're finding time and time again is that what we're doing is not effective. And I will say this, even in these cases where we've been highly effective, there are still things that we could do better. And that I think that's the critical thing. And for those that have, especially in I know in your community and in the law enforcement community, coming from a tactical background, right? It's the after action review is probably one of the most critical components to your evolution and your development for your individual and team capabilities, because it's based solely on this principle of accountability. Everybody is accountable for their actions and what they do, and the protection I think that you have, as long as the culture of your team is good, that you can be candid about your successes and your failures as long as you're being accountable and that you're learning from that. For me as a lieutenant, when I was our team commander, it didn't, if I had a role to play and I screwed it up, then everybody knows that I screwed it up. It's not like you can say, well, you can't blame anybody else. You can't point the finger at someone else. You just have to accept that responsibility. But then you also have to go out and then demonstrate next that you learned from that mistake and you're not going to repeat it. You're going to make other mistakes, most likely. Nothing ever runs perfect or smooth, but you're learning as you go. And so this validation concept, we don't do it well at scale in policing. And I think we have to find a solution or a toolkit, multiple solutions that will help us get to that point. And so I think to give you a plug in what your company is doing, it's kind of that chessboard analogy. And this is, I've said this before, but and there's a lot of people that have talked about this. There's a lot of studies that have been done on the influence of machine learning and its ability to help amplify and enhance human learning. And when talking about what you're doing at crisis response leader training, I like to make the analogy of Big Blue and the chess game. When computer algorithms were first being developed and Big Blue was learning how to play chess, your chess grandmasters crushed it, right? I mean, they didn't have any problem beating it, but the game gets better. And as the game got better, it challenged the chess masters to a better game until it got to the point where the chess masters started losing. Well, then the chess masters have to step up their game to learn because their opponent is better. And that may, in the end, both the chess masters and the game get better. But I think the biggest benefit from that process is the people that come behind. So now, if I'm a beginner and I'm learning how to play chess, I get to play against all of the best chess games that have ever, and players that have ever played, and then beyond. And so what that has done is it has accelerated our ability to learn the game, and it's increased. I can't remember what the exact number is. It's like 200%. The number of grandmasters in chess now, it's crazy compared to what there was in the 1970s, because now you can become a chess master on your phone by playing. And so there is something to be learned from that. Now, I can learn, like, this goes back to kind of like first person shooting games like Call of Duty, whatever. I mean, those things are fun, they're engaging, they're incredibly immersive. But if you think that you're going to take that skill set and then run into a battlefield and have success, you're going to wind up dead pretty quick. Caveat being that you're going to run onto that battlefield with a whole level of situational awareness that people prior to Call of Duty never had. So validation and
validate. So that's what I was hoping to hit on at least first. So probably not maybe let's say that the shortest way to say something to get attention is compliance training is not going to equate to preparedness. And I think a big problem with that is that if I say I have to do a certain amount of training per year, and I check the block, when I actually have to execute it, I'm not going to execute to the standard needed to have it desired end state. So when we go into validation of any type of exercise, the endpoint should be at is how am I validating that I'm able to achieve the desired end state? And what is the end state? Well, to me, it should be like, safely remove threats or risks and reduce the loss of life. Those should be the two primary things. And then beyond that, so it would be,
and you said reduce, not prevent, which is an important distinction.
There should be prevention as well. I think that's a community level issue. But when we come into the training piece and the validation is, the desired end state, we have to quantify what does the end state look like? And then we have to be able to go and say, well, what data did we collect to analyze that and say, did we validate that we are prepared? If all you're doing is a compliance, that in my term, that'd be called a measure of performance. Did you perform the required skill set? Yes, okay, that's a check the block. The measure of effectiveness is whether or not it achieved the desired end state. And the after action review is supposed to take both. It's supposed to take the measure of performance that you did the required training or executed the training, and then did it achieve what you wanted to in the scenario-based problem. What we see right now is that the after action review has really been boiled down into, I had 2 days of training, we've only got 30 minutes left, let's talk about top three, bottom three, and let's wrap it up. So we're not really validating, nor are we doing a call to action of, okay, what does it mean to our future training plan to take the things we've learned as lessons from this validation exercise and apply that to the next iteration of our training. Within the company, what we're trying to do is in that gap we talked about between the basic level of training and the higher level of validation, in between, we should be doing engaging training that can support data collection so that we can support that final after action review with our validation process. That is the core of what we are trying to do.
And one of the barriers to that, going back to after action reviews and doing them at scale, is there's another nasty little element involved in all this that prevents us from doing this and doing it publicly, where everybody can share the lessons learned, and that's called litigation and liability. And I mean, I'll just say it, right? Because no response is ever perfect. And so we live in a litigious society where people are going to be looking for points of failure to exploit for a reward that may be measured a little bit differently, right? Maybe, and I know it's some people might seek a financial reward. Others are looking for societal change and improvement, regardless of what it is. The way the system is designed, it's designed to put a lid on the information about what happened and to contain that until, and there are good reasons for this too, until that case has been adjudicated. Like it's run through its criminal and civil proceedings. And I don't propose to have a solution for this. I just know that, we waited so long for the Uvalde report. I mean, that's probably just a good example. I don't even know where the civil proceedings are or in that case, but I'm sure they'll be ongoing. Every one of these cases is going to have that. And yeah, that's probably a discussion for a different day. But I think, the point that I'm trying to make is that sometimes there are forces that are acting against our own best interest, like being able to learn and move forward. So I say all that because what you have and what you're providing, you really, I think you have a workaround for that, because not only we can actually train in a virtual environment, in that turn point gaming environment, and play against Big Blue, metaphorically speaking. I mean, it's the same concept. It's the same principle.
Yeah.
It's an evolution of that technology. So if I have failures in the game environment, I can learn from them in a safe way. And I can learn from the consequences of good decisions and consequences of decisions that didn't lead to good outcomes, not the desired outcome. And sometimes we think win, lose, pass, fail. And I don't necessarily know that that's even the vernacular that we should be looking at, right? It should be continual improvement, get a little bit better. And as we get better, we need our opponent to get better, so we don't become complacent, so that we can continue to evolve. And so, and maybe for people that didn't listen to last year's episode, how about you just give us a quick, like 60 to 1 minute to 2 minute overview about what CRLT is doing to be able to help prepare not just the officers on the ground, not just teachers, but really leadership that's involved. How do we learn before we get tested in a real environment?
So what our team has created is we took a video game engine, very popular one, Unreal Engine, the creators through Epic Games, the creators of Fortnite. We significantly modified it to do what you talked about, which is like a strategic chess capability. So it's turn-based. And what we did is we integrated that ability to focus on the critical problem-solving requirements of an emergency or incident and linked it to an integrated learning management system. So imagine in the story journey, what you have is the ability to have nationally recognized references, a test generator that can pull data from that and then test you on how much do you know about incident command, how much do you know about lockdown, how do you know much about reunification, whatever it may be. There's a test generator that randomizes core knowledge areas and tests you on that. It'll give you a score at the end, but it won't tell you which ones you got right or wrong, nor will it tell you correct answers. Just gives you a score, but it remembers that performance data or that knowledge retention. Now, as you go through the training journey of individual level modules that are designed to be 30 minutes long, I'm going to one about how to do a lockdown, or what does it mean to be a school resource officer and the threat is surrendered, but I have to do immediate active collection point, stand up as I'm waiting for responders to come in. We have those individual level modules, and then you graduate and move into a fuller tabletop capability, and then from a tabletop to a functional exercise capability. And as you move from that kind of what Jared Kuastani, got to throw a prop out to that guy, that he really understands training in the virtual realm. And he talked about explicit training and implicit training. So our individual level modules are designed to be explicit training on a learning objective, whereas implicit is when you go in the tabletop and the functional exercise capabilities. So now imagine when you've gone out of the individual level training, you go into a fuller capability of law enforcement, fire and rescue, EMS, up against an active shooter at a middle school, church, business complex, those kind of situations. And the AI that you're working against, both of the threat and the thousands of individual AI that could be there for the civilians. Well, by the way, one of the leaders we did demonstration of hybrid artificial intelligence of 100,000 independent AI. All of them and their reactions to your actions is based on real world statistical probability of outcomes and case studies.
So what that means is you've looked at the studies from past incidents and learned what are people likely to do in this scenario? What have actual shooters done in this environment? What gear did they have? What equipment did they have? What decisions did they make? All these things are put into that decision tree in the algorithm that then the machine learns from, right, and can spit that back out in a game environment at random,
FBI active shooter bulletins, Secret Service national threat assessment data on behavior of shooters, mass morbidity studies of gun and violence in the United States from American College of Surgeons, on and on and on. We've even gone down to approach speeds of patrol vehicles and the weight of every single thing you may have on your kit to determine how much you would be able to likely drag a victim based on their weight. All that data is in there. There's probably 400 data tables with hundreds of data points in each data table. And what we put on top of that then is that crawl, walk, run methodology. You can set the parameters to still be statistically accurate, but increase the complexity of the AI that you're going to work against. So you would have a similar objective or end state of identify, neutralize a threat, stop the dying, and then start the recovery process. But we can graduate that from something that maybe only has, violence in a parking lot and is contained and they never get into where there's a lot of potential victims, all the way to the worst case scenario. And then when you come out, the magic behind that learning management is that from the very beginning, when you have the pre-test, it remembered the things you got wrong. And it's looking for what we've established as what's called an event trigger to a data hook. If you trigger something in your simulation experience that is relatable to what you got wrong, it's remembering that and recording it in an after action review that's automatically recorded. When you complete your training objectives, you go into this. It's a free camera approach to you go anywhere you want. Fast forward, rewind, pause, zoom in and out. And as you look at particular incidents, there are color-coded hash marks, and they're linked to the core knowledge areas that you potentially got wrong. So as you deep dive into why did this person die on the objective, it will give you the event trigger. Somebody died of a wound. Maybe it's a sucking chest wound. And then there's a correct response to a question that you got wrong within your pre-test. So now as you're going through the after action review, you have a facilitated prompt of this was a problem. Why did it happen? Would there have been a different approach according to the natural reference capabilities? You get done with that and you come back out from the after action review and you take the same test over again. And we look to see, did your immediate knowledge retention from your pre-test and your post-test, what was that change? When we started the company, the very first thing is we did that analog. We didn't have a simulation at all. We just used that as a training approach with a city, one of the top 5 cities, I think definitely one of the top 10. And we did that for 500 officers. And in that training approach, we saw a 21% increase in knowledge retention over a 5-day period. So we applied that methodology into it. You get all that done, and hopefully you have a knowledge increase. And at the end, from those core knowledge areas and individual and leadership tasks, there's a matrix you can fill out and say, where do I feel I had either an individual or unit gap in that training experience? You fill that out. All the data from the beginning to the end of the experience is exportable for analysis to determine trends, compliance, validation, whatever it may be. And then that should hopefully allow people to interact. And the last couple of things I'll say on it, maybe we'll talk about where's the future, but where we're at right now is that you can do this as a single participant, controlling every single responder on the scene, which you can control 100 or more of those against thousands of AI, or you can do as multi-participant, which means that each one of us could have a different role of responsibility. I'm the tactical team, I'm incident commander, unified commander, medical branch, I'm in charge of the school, whatever you want. All of that's possible. And we have it, but you can download it to be on a minimum hardware requirement of a laptop. This isn't brand new tech. This is something we've been doing for 4 years. So a laptop wouldn't cost that much if you needed that specific machine. but we're also one of the first in the nation to come out with this to be fully cloud-based. So in a comparable cost, you'll be able to make this without having to do any hardware purchase. As long as you have high-speed internet and the bandwidth to get into it, this will be provided through Amazon AWS service. You can be anywhere in the world and do a fully remote session with anybody that you want to that has the license as well.
So let's just talk about that for just a second, because one of the things that we all know is budgets are tight, and for everything that a chief wants to do, they're saying for everything you say yes to, you're saying no to probably 10 things, and it just depends on how expensive things are. But if you go back to the example you gave, and this was when I was still working as a chief, when you came to the active shooter training at one of our local high schools, that was a multi-jurisdictional training event. And I think our area, and a lot of areas do this well, right? I'm not saying that people aren't doing it well. That is something that we do on an annual basis. And in addition to that, we try to incorporate the little things into everyday training, all the way from roll call training, all the way to our monthly training sessions, the way that you try to incorporate, maybe it's handcuffing techniques, maybe it's, refresher on things like the little things like that, how to apply a tourniquet, doing the med tac stuff in not just in an active shooter response, but in a response to a shooting case where you've got multiple injured in a shooting. And I know a lot of communities are experiencing things like that. But that the time and the investment to create the training environment where we're bringing people out from all these different agencies, even as much as we'd like to do that, and as much as we get from that training, even then, you're still limited on the amount of participation that you get, because you can't run 40 officers through a scenario at the same time without having because now your cost is going to go, even higher. So you're running groups of, let's say 4 to 8 officers in a scenario that you've got role players inside, you've got your safety trainers that are in that environment, because all of those things have to be taken into consideration. When we're talking about validation, and because I really want law enforcement leaders and trainers to think about this, that those scenarios right there you shouldn't be learning a whole lot, really. Or maybe that's not the right way to put it. That's not the opportunity. That's not the time really where you're training people how to do this response. You're testing what they've already been trained on to see how well they did, and if it's meeting what you expect. So the training events, the way that you run your training inside your agency throughout the year is all leading up to that point. And if you don't have a mechanism somewhere inside of your agency to test people on their knowledge of active shooter response or critical incident response, then your validation is going to show you that you're not doing it. That's pretty clear. So what you have provided is a very economical way, using the latest advancements in AI and machine learning, to put this at the fingertips of an officer where they can do it on duty or off duty in a classroom environment, in their home office. Hell, they can do it sitting in their car, quite frankly, on their laptop. Although it's probably not ideal to do that. Not in the world of ambush.
Better be switched on, yeah.
Yeah, definitely wouldn't advocate that. But but that's the capability is there. So now, like your kids who have been sitting in their rooms gaming with their friends, we're just really taking that technology. Now, I will say, since we alpha and beta tested the technology, some of the criticisms early on about it were it's not what people visually expected. That was kind of like one of the first barriers. When you talk about barriers to entry and use of this kind of technology, and it's changed a lot since the early days, 3-4 years ago. But that's not necessarily the point of the training. The point of the training is to test your knowledge, to learn what you don't know, and to be able to do it in a way that you actually get to see the consequences, good and bad, of the decisions that you're making in real time in the game. Oh, and then by the way, after you've been in the sim for 20 or 30 minutes, you get to watch a recap of what you just did, and reinforcing the things that you did well, and then also recognizing, oh, yep, I missed that question and I didn't realize that.
I think some of it is, one, understanding and did we make the right choice on the training audience. I think early on in hindsight, we did not communicate well what the intent of the solution is we're offering. This is about junior leader development up to leadership, critical decision making. I think a lot of expectation, particularly where we were early, was that what were the solutions on the market at that time? It was mostly virtual reality. So there was an expectation of some type of first person, almost like Call of Duty experience, where you're immersed in that environment. And those are, fairly good at reducing the amount of resources needed to do things like the shoot, move, communicate, and medicate and de-escalation, use of force type of capability, something very individual and tactical. But the scale and scope of technology, even where it's at right now, you would be hard pressed to put more than 4 officers into virtual reality and then put them against more than, probably performance wise, you'd be hard pressed to put more than 40 AI into that program with them. So if you're talking about civil unrest, mass casualty incidents, a roving active shooter incident in an entire property, what it means to your tactical team, incident commander, unified commander, it's not going to do well at that. What we wanted to do is pull away from those individual level skills and talk about how can we reduce, again, resources that would be required to do something like an incident or unified command level exercise, because of all of the costs for the vehicles, the time, the role players, everything else. That was a communication gap that we needed to communicate with our early adopters better. Now, also with that is what we try to do is optimize and stylize the look of the scene, because there's this, we don't have time probably going the uncanny valley and everything else. But what we wanted to do was to say, hey, look, we're presenting you with problems, right? You might not even think that this would really happen to you, but what if it did? And how would you handle it? We're trying to throw you those scenario-based challenges that you would have to react to in order to put it in your thought process, and and then use it later if you needed it.
Yeah, create that flexible
consequence management is what you call it all the time, and I love that. We're talking about, if I make a decision now, what's the first order consequence or impact, the second and the third impact, which could go all the way back of what I do in the first 10 minutes of a tactical fight. How's that impact my community for the next 5 years?
So let's take this and go back to the DOJ report from Uvalde and look at what could organizations, how can they benefit from that tragedy to better prepare themselves and insulate themselves from a failed response through the use of your sim? Because let's just say this, for example. Let's say you're running through a sim of that event, and let's go to that first point of failure when the officers retreat after that first contact. What the sim is going to teach you is the consequence of that decision. And now imagine that you're sitting in a desk and you're going through this. And this is what I love about it being turn point, right? Is that because the enemy always has a say, no matter what. They're always adapting. And so you play that sim, you make that decision to fall back, and we can look at some of the other decisions that were made. Like if that's you, right? You're like if you're the one that's getting shot at in that moment, there's not a whole lot else that you're able to think about. You can't think about, well, where's, how many injured do we have? Or where's the casualty collection point going to be? Where do I need to start setting up where's the incident command post going to be? Where's the unified command post going to be? Where are the traffic control points going to be? All these are things that somebody has to start doing. And for every second that's ticking on the clock, in the way here's the way to think about it. And I was just having this conversation with my youngest son, who's really close to getting his driver's license. And we were out on a drive on the interstate yesterday. And I was talking to him about when you're driving on the interstate, you don't just focus on the car in front of you, because if you're reacting to the car in front of you, there's a whole host of other things that are happening around you that you just don't see. And if you're waiting for that car to brake, you're already too late. You've got to look as far up the road as you can. You see the brake lights coming. We know something else is up there. I can move my foot from the gas pedal to the brake and be ready. I'm not being stuck. Time isn't time isn't going to be as compressed for me as it's going to be for somebody that's staring at the car in front of them, or worse yet, the person that's looking at their phone that's not even looking at the car in front of them, right? So you can kind of see what happens in, like, as if you hit your brakes unnecessarily, someone behind you is hitting the brakes. And if you're in a high congested, high traffic area, what does that lead to? And if it's rush hour, you're looking at backups on the interstate. What's the best example of that? A state trooper or police officer's got somebody pulled over on the side of the road, and you've been waiting for 20 minutes in traffic, and you're getting up there, man, this must be a really bad accident. And then you get up there, and what do you see? A traffic stop.
Yeah.
And you got traffic on both.
Yes, it might be on the opposite side. Everybody's just looking.
Yeah, everybody's slowing down and looking to see what's happening. And it's so those are the unintended consequences, or the things that you're not thinking about. So call it the butterfly effect, whatever you want to call it. But this is what these sims are teaching us. So imagine now that I've had an opportunity to see what happens. Okay, we fell back. We reverted to a contain and call out. We don't necessarily realize, that was another lesson, right? They didn't realize that the school was in a lockdown and teachers were locking in their classrooms, and so there was all these things that were happening around that other incident that multiple players are all engaged in it. And when communication breaks down, everything else starts breaking down, and it's a matter of how bad and how fast it's going to get. Or how bad it's going to get, or either way. The consequences of waiting outside that classroom instead of regrouping and going right back in, or putting together a hasty plan, right? Like, hey, somebody outside, I'm going to, I need you to come up and grab your baton and hit that window 3 or 4 times. On my go, hit that window, because we're going to draw the attention of the shooter, and then we're going to go through that point. All these little things that are easy to think about in hindsight, but in that moment, if you haven't practiced things like that, if you haven't trained, if you haven't seen somebody else do it and realize, oh, that's an option for me, put all these little different options into I call it your tool belt, or whatever, your mental tool belt. That's what we're talking about in this game. Okay, and because I waited 60 minutes or longer, there were additional casualties based on the morbidity studies that you have that are built into the sim. And then after the fact, when we look at the types of injuries that were involved, a gunshot wound to the leg, maybe a small artery, not a main artery. But if we don't get a tourniquet on that, instead of bleeding out in 20 minutes or 10 minutes, you have all these different things that are occurring inside of the sim, and you get to learn from that in where nobody's actually dying. But man, well, yeah, there's so much.
Two examples.
Spit out too much.
No, two examples. Imagine you're in our simulation, and hopefully within 10 minutes. So imagine this: you're whether single or multi-participant, it is going to start with the way it works with us. Let's say there's not a school resource officer on scene. So it could be Columbine, it could be Uvalde, something similar to that. It similarly starts with artificial intelligence working against each other inside the simulation until somebody gets to the parameters based on data that says call 911. That AI calls an AI 911. The dispatch asks interrogative questions and then feeds that back to the CAD of the participants, and then routes them from the jurisdiction on how long it would actually take them based on randomized locations in the jurisdiction, how long it would take them to get to that scene. So they didn't start showing up. So imagine then the call from dispatch out to those immediate patrol officers is there's a shooter in the library. What's your first question?
Oh, well, I got 100 questions. So,
Or some are your first thoughts?
well,
right?
where is the library?
Okay, so
Right?
that's
I'm
what
trying to orient to.
You're trying to orient to where the problem is, where you need to do something. If that had been the caller, which there was a caller from Columbine, hiding in the library, that was one of the situations. What if it had been a call in room 112, which there was a child in room 112 calling at Uvalde, right? So now it comes out from dispatch and forwarding through the lack of communication of what happened on the ground. That would immediately been seen as a problem if you had done it that way inside the simulation. The second thing is the situational awareness. My exterior to interior ability to navigate directly to the threat and determine, oh, there's an interior door connecting 111 and 112. There are windows to utilize. Can I at least do a containment and start some type of hasty movement of wounded from the point of injury to a casualty collection point? Because of the 60-minute, what you talked about, what we have with the mass morbidity, we're a big believer in what it means to the golden hour rule, at least in a focus of getting people to, appropriate level of care based on gunshot wound. So that is one thing that comes out very quickly, maybe is a lesson learned from having done the simulation 4 to 5 times ahead of time. They've said, man, we really should have at our generalized dispatch, we should have a blueprint floor plan of all of our government facilities. And maybe they could be color coded. And there's a way, if I actually walk inside the building, if I don't know where I'm at, I can look up and see on the corners of hallways, blue and green, blue 1, green 2. And it says, hey, to navigate from where you're at to the hall, to the library, you need to go down green 2, right? Something that gives you visual abilities to link where you're at on the ground to a communication capability for situational awareness. Typically in our simulation, that as a frustration point will come out in 10 minutes. Now, fast forward to other incidents about the ability of staging medical to an inbound route to an outbound route linked to traffic control to where you can seamlessly move them in from your casualty collection point to your ground evacuation transfer point. And how fast does that have to happen? In the simulation, in comparison to what national standard we're talking about right now with the rescue task force and getting that introduced into the warm zone in 15 minutes, and what it means to your time of travel back to a level 2 surgical care, you really only got about the 21-minute mark in most locations to begin ground evacuation. That means from the time of the RTF entering to the time you start ground evacuation, you got 7 minutes. And if you don't, your expiration of died of wounds is going to climb by about probably 40%. So that is something in a fuller experience with the tabletop, you're probably going to see that in about the 30 to 45 minutes of training, is that my died of wounds rates really started climbing because I didn't introduce the ability to stop the dying, the ground evacuation piece. I didn't think that through fast enough.
Yeah, and for one of the things that you mentioned early on in our conversation, when we're just talking about the number of people that you have to train, and you're talking about span of control, the other thing that we're experiencing inside of law enforcement is the rate of attrition and the rate of turnover, and people are moving from one area to another. So your expertise is traveling inside of your organization.
It's like 15 to 20% per year.
Yeah.
Most of society is like that.
So if you're not getting the training, even a couple, because your patrol division is going to be the backbone of this response, and they're primarily the ones that are getting the refresher training, the stuff on the ground. Now, hopefully people are sending their entire agency through these trainings, because it could be a detective out on the street that is going to be the one that's closest to the school when the radio call does come out. And that's it's such an important point that you made, because when that call does come out on the radio, this is something that we're not good at in law enforcement. All you have to do is watch any of the body camera footage or things from shooting incidents where everybody starts talking at the same time. People talk over each other. There's not a lot of listening that goes on when it should, particularly, and that's a problem with younger, less experienced officers, because we all go through that. When you're learning, you're like that. When you ask me that question, I'm immediately going through in my mind, like all the questions that the information that I do want. But even somebody that's really experienced in playing the telephone game, that there's going to be information that gets lost. And, for a patrol officer, anything that they get over the air that they're getting from dispatch, you have to assume that you're missing information all the time. You're trying to get as much information as you can. And then even if you have with the great 911 operators and people and our communications operators are trained very well, they can only get so much information. And so they're relying on people that are under high stress to provide them information. They do a fantastic job of calming people down and getting information. But even then, right, believe what half of what you see, none of what you hear, until you can show otherwise. And I just, it's
So when we see, and I saw, there's a good case on this, listening to some traffic of an active shooter incident on the East Coast. And I think one of the examples was, several different officers, because they're only really operating on one channel. Everybody's on the same channel. Several different officers asked the same question like 15 times in a 5-minute time period. The dispatch had to interrupt the incident command when they're trying to do the job to fill in other people. In our simulation, we have a fully functioning dispatch. You can be the dispatcher or AI can run it. And we have multiple channel selection capabilities with integrated voice communications. So now we're forcing people to talk the way they would talk. And what we typically see in the beginning of the sim is there's not much radio traffic because it's only about the first responders and there's only 3 to 4 people and they might be coordinated with each other or with dispatch, but that can be handled. And then it starts to slow down a little bit because they're trying to identify and neutralize the threat. So they're not really focusing as much on external comms. Then all of a sudden you get that second wave of people that are coming onto the scene at about the 8 to 10 or 12-minute mark, and they don't know what's going on. So they're interrupting communication of the tactical piece, trying to get additional information so they can figure out how they can help. And then comms get over flooded and everybody's talking on top of each other, and we started losing a lot of communication discipline. I think another benefit of simulations, whoever you go with, is figure those things out now, because communication discipline is probably the number 3 thing on my list. Integrate, synchronize assets, and communication. Those are 3 key elements to establishing proper incident response.
Hashtag STFU.
So wouldn't it be better to do that in training rather than having to figure it out on the scene during an actual incident?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean that. I say it lightheartedly, but I mean it. And I say that knowing that I've made that same mistake, many times myself as a young officer, and you do learn that, right? But that's, again, I want to go back to, and we can kind of start to wrap this up. Otherwise, we'll be talking all day. When you think about the training itself, that base level of training, getting officers trained up, we've kind of talked about this. And you come from a special operations background. I love this concept. In an ideal world, and I asked you this question before we went on the air, right? If you could wave your magic wand and start getting ideal resources and the best environment set up to optimize our response, because this is the Coptimizer podcast, right? We're talking about cop optimization here. With a quick sidebar, when you were mentioning it, like the time it takes for an officer to drag somebody out of the way and move, for a future sim, for a future version of the sim, I don't know when we get, maybe that's version like 3.4 or something. If you could actually take the officer's individual level of preparedness and integrate that into the sim.
Yeah, integrate your own performance, kind of like Fort Sciences or anybody else where you can integrate your individual performance capabilities.
Yeah,
talk about it.
And I say that only half joking, because I teach a class on, we call it the blood doesn't lie, right? Where insulin resistance is 70 to 80% of the police population. Obesity rates are 80%. Morbid obesity rates, climbing, to 30% of the police population. we're just not a very fit and healthy population. And this is not because we like to eat donuts, even though some people might like to eat donuts. It's a high stress environment. That's a whole nother class, but that's a reality in the response. If you're the officer that's 70 pounds overweight, and now you got your gear on you, and now you got the stress of the incident on you, your capabilities are going to be limited compared to the officers that is fit, that's been training, that can move at twice your speed. I mean, these are realities of what we're talking about. So this is where I throw that in, because if I'm going to wave my magic wand, and I saw this, we talked about this last year, and I talked about this on a couple episodes. So ideally, if we set up a police department, let's just say you have a mid-sized agency, like my agency is 150 sworn. What if we could have 200 officers in that police department, and then we build in an entire extra shift, an entire extra group of people, where now you can, instead of working 12-hour shifts at 20% reduced, 30% reduced reduction in manpower, where you're just trying to cover your minimums to get people out on the street to provide your basic level of support for the things that are happening in your day-to-day activities. What if we had enough people to be able to say, okay, you're on a training rotation. So and just say for a quick discussion point, you're instead of being in a week where you're on your regular work and days off rotation, you're actually on a day off training rotation, where now you get 3 extra days or 4 extra days a month where you come to work and do nothing but train. And then, oh, by the way, you also get to recover. That means we can teach things like mindfulness, meditation, and nutrition, and we can reinforce like sleep hygiene and all these things that will optimize individuals. But by the way, guess what? We're also going to get an additional 4 to 6 hours or 8 hours on the range. We're going to get 4 to 6, 8 hours in the mat room, another day in a classroom. Oh, and time to run people through a sim. So we're getting all this time to train while we're not having to be responsible also for handling calls for service. If you could get that done, then I think you would start to close that gap in some of these issues that we're having when it comes to these, not just in critical incident response from a mass casualty event, but just from your Minneapolis, your Ferguson, your other incidents that are high profile, police use of force incidents that communities, that leads to all kinds of turmoil. And then, oh man. So think about that model, because I saw something that again kind of reinforced this discussion that we were having last year. Somebody posted it. I saw it on LinkedIn the other day, where police officers are deployed 95% of their time and then trained 5% of their time, which I think that was a little generous. Whereas in the special operations community, they train 95% of the time and deploy 5% of the time. So imagine, and I'm not saying you can get to that point, but imagine a policing world where we had a lot more time to train. And then let's just say we got to train like that the first 12 to 18 months, you were in a training environment. I mean, consistently across the country. Man, policing would be so much better.
Well, you probably just labeled one of the biggest national challenge, maybe even global challenges we have with policing. In my opinion, in the military, that would have been called our operational readiness cycle, right? So you would have I'm on alert. So I minimize training to local garrison area, and all of my stuff is packed and already ready to go. And then I have another one where I am in support cycle, which means I'm the one getting the ready group out the door. So I can do some training, but I've got to go do a call out to come back in and bring, push that package out to get downrange somewhere. And then the other cycle would be the training cycle, which means that my opportunity for a third of the time period on an annual basis is dedicated, into some type of training. And it won't happen all at once. It's usually like, 2 months here, 2 months here, 2 months here, something like, per quarter. So you could do that, and that would allow you to expand that kind of crawl, walk, run training expectation we talked about to get to a validation on a year. I think the problem right now is everybody's like, man, I can't do anything because, if I do that, the sacrifice and call for service to the communities right now. If we were able to get to a point of understanding at the community level, we need a surge capability to go above where we're at right now in order to get that regiment started. My guess would be is that after a couple of years, we will start seeing a performance change to where it is we don't have to put a lot more officers into one problem set. We'll have increased preparedness and proficiency, competence and confidence of our officers, that we can start pulling back out a little bit because we'll have started creating a more capable force. But I do think that in order to get to where we want to go, communities have to understand it's going to take some sacrifice. And some of that means we got to look at our budgets, and we got to look at giving the officers, giving the chiefs the resources they need to get that started. Otherwise, right now, what I think we almost equated it back in the days as, this like the whack-a-mole strategy. Well, I'll just put out the conventional forces and I'll hit every single thing that comes up on my radar, and I'll just hammer it as hard as I can. Well, what's the desired end state? We did that for probably 15 years before we figured out, man, that's not working in the global war on terror. We need to be more precise and more effective in our strategy. We have to look at our end state. I would say right now it's very similar in understanding in law enforcement in terms of what's our end state in terms of preparedness and how we're going to get to that point.
Yeah. All right. Let's wrap this up because we're over time, but this is one of those things that we're gonna have to have a third episode because we've got to dive into this more. And I've made this comment, I've written about it. It's not to say that I'm not one of these people that doesn't think that we shouldn't be involved in Ukraine or other places. I just want to use this as an example. After Ferguson back in 2014, in that 2015 timeframe, we supposedly made this massive investment in public safety moving forward. And, I give a lot of credit to the Obama administration and what they did with the 21st Century Policing Initiative, because it's very similar to the Uvalde. It was a good watershed moment for us to kind of take a deep introspection, what we're doing well, what we're not doing well. I would hope that every police chief in America has read that report, and they break it out at least once a year and read it and reassess where they are, because we learned a lot from that. But what we didn't do was have a sustained investment in developing the lessons that were put out in that report. So we saw that again just in 2022. There was, hey, we're 7-8 years post Ferguson. Where are the implementations of these lessons learned? What have we done? And I'm not saying we haven't improved, because we have, but if from an incremental perspective, not anywhere near enough. So you have an incident like what happens with Minneapolis. The cost estimates vary depending on who you talk to, but the police response there and the damage done to American communities, you can't measure the damage that's been done in the trust and the relationships between police and communities. But I think I saw an estimate that was like $2 billion worth of damage that was done in the U.S., and I think it's far exceeds that from an
just loss of opportunity.
Yeah,
right.
But I made this analogy. I'm like, yeah. So we without any second thought, without really any real discussion or debate, we have sent billions of dollars to invest in the security of Ukraine. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have done that, but imagine what we could be doing in America for our first responders, our teachers, and others that have a long-term impact on community safety, because the best investment, the best crime reduction strategies start with investing in kids before they're age 3, or really quite, prenatally, honestly, but that's a whole other discussion. But the amount of equipment, the amount of training that we could do with a similar type of investment, and how much safer and how much better infrastructure in public safety would be in America. And this is where I'm going to kind of, I'll make my final point for the day. And this is kind of where I was heading, is like, thankfully, there are people like you that are out there that are willing to take a risk and to try to develop a product and something where you're taking your life's experience and you've invested in this. It's made a huge, significant investment, by the way, taking great personal risk to bring something to the first responder community that will save lives. It will improve performance. But yet there is police departments, we're not the DOD, and we don't have $1 trillion budget. And so there is no R&D. And this is what communities, again, need to understand. There is no research and development going on. That's really, I can't say none. There's very little. There's from a percentage perspective, very little investment that's being made into improving public safety. So we rely on private corporations and people like you to take risks to try to bring, innovate and bring something to market that's gonna move the needle. Where, man, I sure would like to see something at a national level that says, look, here are the things that we're going to do, and at a much bigger scale than what we see that trickles through the DOJ, BGA, and other programs, COPS programs. Those, I guess, basically what I'm saying is we need to take those programs and scale them up tenfold at a minimum, because then we can really begin to innovate. Then we can really make an impact on officer optimization throughout the country, where the standard is raised for all police departments, whether you're a 5 or 6 person department, or Uvalde is a 6 officer agency. The impact that the decision, of their successes and failures impact the NYPD, which is the largest police department in the world. And the average community member, they don't know the difference, and they expect that same type of response. So that's a very, very long way of saying that if we want that special operations style or success in deployments, then we have to make the investments that they made and do it at scale.
I agree with you. I could talk more. It'll be another hour.
Well, yeah, we'll have to do that again. And just so people, again, just to kind of a quick recap. I think ultimately what we're talking about here is we have to invest in our people. We have to invest in the technology. We have to find best practices. We have to innovate, and we have to have a mindset of continuous improvement, because if we don't, we're just, it's just rinse and repeat. Same failures, different color patch, different, varied colors of uniforms. But I think that, that's going to continue to be the result until we can start to try to get out in front, get upstream, solve some of these issues before they become problematic.
And that's not a law enforcement only challenge. For over 30 years in conventional, special ops, and the intelligence community, the problems that you just discussed are the same problems I've seen across the board in some form or fashion throughout my experiences as well. They're significant leader challenges, but I would say, in closing, what I say is that right now we're starting to gain greater awareness. The problem is we need a community emphasis. I think we need a ground roots push to start taking care of the problem. At the same time, we look at more resource allocation from the federal level. I really would challenge, what are the community leaders doing to support our law enforcement and first responder community so they can increase their preparedness?
Yeah. And that's what I want to see more of that moving forward, is when we do have these events, let's dig into the training records. Let's dig into the investments that communities are making. at all levels. Let's look at what their policies are. Let's look at where the successes have been and emulate those. Let's look at where the failures have been and eliminate those. And I think we're on our way. All that being said, I say this time and time again, policing in America has never been better. If you think that policing is bad, well, you're wrong. We do amazing things in law enforcement. And so I don't want this to sound like this is that we're beating up on the profession I love so much. But I also, I'm also a realist and know that you have to invest, and you have to be critical. You have to be honest in your self-assessment, what you're doing well, what you're not doing well. And people, again, when these failures happen, it's not just the police department. They are local, state, and federal failures and community failures every single time. There's a lot of blame to go around, and I'm not the type of person that likes to sit around and just blame all the time. I want to find solutions. I want to find ways to improve moving forward. And again, people like you, I really appreciate everything that you've done. Thanks for spending a couple of hours with us here on the Coptimizer podcast. Where can people find you, Todd?
I'm on LinkedIn a lot, but so I try to engage with everybody. I love talking about this. Is pretty passionate about it. But we've also got a company webpage. So if you go to www.crisisresponse.tech, TECH, you get more information as well as a contact ability through the company. Tons of videos on YouTube if you look up the company, but Facebook. So we're out there.
Yeah, and I just want people to know we just scratched the surface on what that technology is capable of doing. I think hopefully we gave you enough to really think about. For leaders out there, before I sign off, if you're relying on somebody else to do this for you, I'll give you the line from the Shooter movie. Just when you think you're right, you're wrong. So,
when you think it'll never happen here, it will.
Yeah, it's not a matter if, it's a matter of when, and your response is gonna have a significant impact on whether it's looked upon favorably or negatively. So get out there, get after it. Look up Todd, look up anyone that can bring some assistance to your training and to your departments. Make sure you share with each other. There's a lot of great people out there doing great things. Until the next time, we'll be 1042.